Okay, let's talk about compression and logic. First, a definition of what compression is. Compression is the reduction of dynamic range. So what that means is if we look at this region here, the dynamic range is the difference between the loudest part, probably the snare right here, and the smallest waveform that's theoretically in here, which you probably can't see, but somewhere like around here. The reason dynamic range is important is that the goal of compression is to reduce dynamic range. Basically what that means is you want to make the loudest parts quieter, and that in turn lets you make the quietest parts louder without clipping or eating up unnecessary headroom in your mix. Overall, in the end, what compression is doing is it makes your sounds more uniform and loud. So when you're trying to make your songs loud, compression is obviously going to be your friend. Now let's look at the nuts and bolts of how to use Logic's compressor. First, I'm going to play this kick, snare, 808 loop right here. Now, in real life, you probably wouldn't actually use this loop. You'd probably just use another one. But it's a good example to use to show how to use compression because the differences in volume are so pronounced. And in real life, vocals, for example, can be really dynamic like this. So the techniques I'm about to show you actually will definitely be applicable. So let's bring up Logic's stock compressor. Now this is actually many compressor models all in one. They're all a bit different since they're modeled after analog compressors. They all sound and act a tiny bit different. So I'm going to use this one for now, but definitely know that you can achieve similar results with the other models. Now before we begin, I'm going to turn auto gain off, and I'll explain this section a bit later. Okay, now let's dive into compression 101. Let's look at this ratio knob and set it to 1.0 to 1. 101. Get the joke? Compression 101? Okay, sorry. But this is actually an important point. With the ratio set to 1 to 1 like this, no compression can occur. So keep an eye on this meter up here while I move some dials down here and see if you can notice any gain reduction. Okay, so there was no compression occurring, right? And that's because with the ratio at 1 to 1, it's saying that for every 1 decibel over the threshold, and we'll get to the threshold in a second, give me 1 decibel of output. So 1 decibel in, 1 out. 1 to 1, the same thing, nothing's happening. However, if we put the ratio at 2 to 1, that's telling the compressor that when the threshold is exceeded by 2 decibels, give me 1 decibel. Or if it's exceeded by 10 decibels, attenuate the sound down to 5 decibels. Again, 2 to 1. So basically, the higher the ratio you set here, the more compression will theoretically take place. So I'm going to set the ratio to actually 1.2 to 1, which is still extremely low, but compression can occur. And now, where compression starts occurring, where and when, depends on the threshold. The threshold is a super important part of your compressor, arguably the most important, and it tells the compressor anything above this input level, for example, -20, I want you to compress it. So real quick, watch this input gain meter here. Okay, so this loop is peaking at -1.2. So let's put the threshold just slightly below that. And now let's see what happens. So if you were watching the meter, you would have seen it barely moving because there's just so little compression happening. You probably would need a microscope. Let's turn up the ratio though, and now see what happens. Still very little going on, but quite a bit more, right? So let's review what happened here. Essentially what's going on is the snare volume is being brought down, but the kick volume should be staying the same. So now let's bring the threshold way down and see what happens. So now we're compressing both the snare and the kick. So even if we have the threshold set to like -20, it's compressing the kick as well as the snare, which is kind of defeating the purpose in a way because you're squashing everything. So let's set the threshold so that it's only compressing the snare and not the kick. Okay, so it's much more even with the compression on, right? So the big takeaway points until now are that the ratio tells the compressor how much to squash the incoming signal, and the threshold tells the compressor where to start compressing the signal based on where you set it. Okay, now that we've squashed the snare by quite a bit and thus reduced the dynamic range, we can now turn up the overall level of this part without clipping. And there's two ways to do this. The first one is manual with the makeup gain. So let's just watch this meter up here and see how much gain reduction we're getting approximately. Okay, so we'll turn up the makeup by roughly 10 dB or so. So if we don't use makeup, we can use auto gain, which essentially kind of turns up the makeup gain automatically based on the amount of gain reduction you're getting. So let's put this at 0 and see what happens. Okay, and now if you want less auto gain, you can actually bring it all down with the -12 option. All right, let's move on to attack and release. These are both also really important. So attack is the time it takes for your compressor to start working after the incoming signal goes above the threshold level that you set. Another way of looking at this, or how I think about it, is it's kind of how fast the compressor wakes up, jumps out of bed, and starts working. So a faster attack time gives you a harsher, more squashed sound, potentially, because the compressor is immediately pulling down the volume of whatever you're sending through it. Slower attack times, however, will let some of the original uncompressed sound through, unaffected, before compression starts. And that's a nice way to keep some of the pop or some of the click to your sound, kind of like the initial transients on your drums. But maybe you want to bring up the tail ends of those drums so they're more audible and maybe you can hear a little bit more room noise, that kind of a thing. So let's try it. Let's move the attack time back just a tiny bit. Pretty big difference, right? It's letting the initial transient of the snare through. Basically, as we raise the attack time, we're getting less and less gain reduction because the compressor has less and less snare drum to compress. Now let's set the attack to be as slow as possible. So yeah, here there's very little compression happening because the compressor is waiting 200 milliseconds before it kicks in, by which time the snare has kind of mostly come and gone, so there's not much to compress really. Okay, on to release time. This is the time it takes for your compressor to stop working after the signal drops below your threshold. In other words, this is how long the compressor keeps working before it stops. So most of the time you'll want your release times to be fairly long. 5 milliseconds is just super duper short, and I find that usually isn't so helpful. So I'd say you usually want something between 30 milliseconds and like 200 milliseconds. But let's look at this visual aid here on the graph, and now we can actually see how the release is working on the gain reduction. Okay, you can see these lines that pop down that are kind of a V shape. These indicate the amount of gain reduction you're getting. Now watch the line on the right as I slowly raise the release time. So the line on the right kept extending, right? Going further and further to the right. And that was because after the snare drum sound went away, the compressor was trying to keep doing its thing and keep compressing. Again, it usually sounds best to set your release times between 30 milliseconds and 200 milliseconds, which is still very fast, but it totally depends on your source material. Play around with this, and over time you'll get more of an instinct when it comes to your release times. Now, auto is an interesting feature for if you don't want to exactly set your release time, but you have a rough idea. This button takes what you've set in your release and dynamically adjusts it depending on what's going through the compressor. Actually, Logic's documentation doesn't really go into great detail about what's going on here, but in practice, I've found this button to be like an intelligent adjustment to whatever release you have set here. So if you set your release really slow, the compression will still have a slow release time, but it will just get adjusted a bit. Same if you set it really fast, you'll still have a fast release time, but it just gets slightly massaged to be theoretically a little better, I guess. And it's worth definitely trying when you're setting your release times. So the last thing we need to touch on in this particular compressor model is the mix knob. This allows you to blend your compressed sound, which is all the way to the right, with your uncompressed sound, which is all the way to the left, and to various degrees in between. So right up the middle here, we have half compressed and half uncompressed. Right here, it's mostly compressed with some uncompressed. Here, it's mostly uncompressed with some compression, etc. You might have actually heard of this concept before. This is called parallel compression, and this is a great way to make your sounds kind of more present and upfront in your mix. So let's look at some of these other models that have what's called a knee control. The knee refers to how the compressor goes in and out of compression and non-compression. So if we have the knee set to be hard, which is all the way left, compression will only start when the signal exceeds exactly what we have set on the threshold knob. With a soft knee, however, all the way to the right, the compressor will actually start compressing before the signal reaches the threshold. And this results in more compression usually. Let me play an example of what I mean. Here's a hard knee. And now let's make the knee soft. And of course, you can set it somewhere in between those extremes. Okay, the last big feature we need to tackle is the sidechain section, which will be off by default. This is a little advanced, but I at least want to introduce you to the concept. Sidechaining is really cool because it tells the compressor to only listen to certain frequencies and therefore only compress those frequencies. So in this example, we only want to compress the snare, right? And we know the kick drum is mostly low frequencies. What we could do is set the filter here to a high pass filter. So now the compressor is only listening to higher signals. So let's go to listen. And now we're hearing what the compressor is hearing. And now what we can do is compress the snare much more because we've taken away the kick drum's influence on the compressor. So let's lower the threshold. And now let's turn on to hear the final result. So again, we were able to compress the snare even more because the majority of the kick's frequency range was not triggering the compressor. It's a very cool technique. And if you're familiar a little bit with de-essing, it's a really similar idea. It allows you to focus the compressor to a specific area of the frequency spectrum so you can just compress what you need. Okay, those are the most important areas to know about when it comes to compression and logic. These concepts admittedly are not very intuitive, at least they weren't for me. So now you have to go and practice these techniques for sure, and pretty soon they'll start to gel and become second nature. Okay, until next time, peace.